Well, thank you. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here today. I appreciate the invitation to present from the Museum Association of the Caribbean, and I also appreciate the invitation to participate from my colleague, Dr. Joanne Hippoly. As you know, my name is Mary Elliot, and I am a museum specialist at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And I also had the pleasure of co-curating the Slavery and Freedom exhibition, inaugural exhibition for the museum. That's okay, thank you. I can't talk about this exhibition without telling you that this was produced by a dynamic team. Again, I co-curated the exhibition. The other co-curator is Dr. Nancy Burkhoff, but we also have the assistance of a dynamic young scholar, Sion Woldemichael, and our Associate Director of Curatorial Affairs, Dr. Rex Ellis. I also have to say that we actually had the sense of being in a master class because quite often we had our director, Lonnie Bunch, sit in on our sessions. And he was very deliberate in what he wanted to see with slavery and freedom, which was a good thing. This gives you a view of the History Gallery. As was mentioned earlier, there are 3 galleries in this museum: Community Gallery, Culture Gallery, and History Gallery. The History Gallery includes stories from the 15th century, starting with Africa and Europe, all the way up through the second election of President Barack Obama. If you look, you'll see where people are queuing up at the top, and that is queuing up to go into an elevator that takes you back through time. It started 2008, and the elevator doors open at 1400. And that's when you enter into the Slavery and Freedom History exhibition, right? If you look, you'll notice here, we have the rail car that was mentioned by my colleague, Michelle, and you also see the Tuskegee Airman plane. If you were to think about, right about here, is our Changing America exhibition. The vistas from all of these different perspectives allows you to look back at that history and to think about where we came from and to reflect on where we're going. I'm going to speak to you specifically about slavery and freedom. So some of the things that I want you to keep in mind when we had to think about collecting is definitely think about that this is a shared story, a human story, an American story. It's seen through the African American lens, and I'm going to speak to that in more detail in a moment. We sought out first-person accounts. We have lots of quotes in the exhibition and lots of personal stories. To focus on Black Lives Whole, we wanted to show an in-depth picture of the individual. We look at the hardship and struggle, the harsh realities of slavery, but we look at the resistance, the resilience, and the survival of a people. And we also looked at the profit and power juxtaposed against the human cost. And then, of course, we look at African and African American foundational contributions to the development of the Atlantic world, the global economy, and the nation. So we say this is seen through the African American lens. Well, what does that mean? When that lens looked out into the world, they saw white Americans, Europeans. They saw American Indians. They saw a cross-section of people. But it is told from the perspective of the African American. So you look at this image at the top, and the image at the top is the story, the image that you usually see, the narrative, the traditional narrative, the big house. And then African Americans are kind of in the background. They're kind of there in the landscape. But what we did is we zoomed in on the people. Now understand that the people is focused on African Americans, but it also includes some people that some folks may not have expected to be in our exhibition, but we had to be, as has been said today, inclusive. So when we talk about the human story, we could have told the story from the traditional way that people say, there was Johnny, he had a hoe, Johnny got up at 4 a.m., he ate this for breakfast, he went out to the field, he was charged with cultivating this amount of land, He'd go back home, back to his slave cabin. He'd eat this for dinner, and then he'd go to sleep and get up and start the next day all over again, right? I don't know, I think this is on it's rotating, yeah. So this is the story of Solomon Williams. He was a master blacksmith. I'm going to talk to you about what's in our collection, but we were fortunate enough to get some objects loaned to us to help tell this story. This is important. We decided not to do that broad stroke of the story of enslavement. So we look at the human story. So we look at life, work, and enslavement, and we gave more dimension to this individual. So when you look at life, you think of Solomon Williams and his experience and skill as a blacksmith. He created this ornate grave marker, which is the grave marker for his wife, and he created many of them for the enslaved community in Cane River. Work, he created this double helix drill bit, this uneducated man who had the intellect to be able to create this very artistic, ornate piece of work, this tool. And enslavement, no doubt, as the blacksmith on the plantation site, he was responsible for creating the restraints that were used on the enslaved community down at the Cane River site. So, when it comes to collecting, how do we do that to tell these more human stories? Just like Joanne mentioned, how are we going to get all this information? So we're fortunate to have people like Dr. Charles Bloxon, who is a collector. He collects a lot of literary materials, but he also collects a lot of artifacts from Africa. Well, it turns out a few years ago, he actually received a collection from descendants of Harriet Tubman. Now, while we had a wish list out there, and there were many artifacts that people thought, there's no way in the world these things are still out in the world, because we know people have been collecting for quite some time. Charles Bloxon brought to the attention of our director that he had these artifacts. He had stored them under his bed. He had held on to them for a few years, for 7 years, yeah. And when he understood about our museum, he said, this is where these artifacts need to be. As our director tells the story, he couldn't believe it. But when Dr. Bloxon brought the materials in, when they actually had a chance to see the materials, it brought our director to tears. Because you can only imagine, as we said, we look at the iconic and we look at the average man, right? And how much more iconic can you get than Harriet Tubman's story during the period of slavery and freedom? Not only with the Underground Railroad, but also her serving as a spy during the Civil War. Then we come to the Fox Wages book. And the Fox Wages book, I'll share a story with you about how we interpret that, but what's important about this is that we work with auction houses. Now, everyone thinks the Smithsonian has a bucket of gold, right? We may have a nice amount for our budget, but as has been mentioned by my colleagues, we have a cross-section of exhibitions. So I won't even tell you how we are in our collections meeting when we're like, are you sure you really, because I need this. You know? So what I'm very proud about is we are good stewards with our funding, and that includes federal and private funds. And so we try to make sure that we are thoughtful about how we go forward. So while we may have a nice budget, there are times that we don't always get everything we go for at auction, right? But we identify those things that are priority, and we're really proud to have this Fox's Wages book. Now, the presentation earlier, where we heard about inclusiveness, right? People say, all right, well, this is the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Am I going to see me in there? They're going to talk about me? And that can cross race, that can cross class, that can cross gender. So in our section on the transatlantic slave trade, who would think we would have a book that talks about the wages paid to crew members on a slave ship? Okay, so we have that. How do we interpret it? In that book, we understand that people committed suicide. We understand that people ran away. We understand that people died and their wages were given to their widows. So, what is our role to help engage the audience to think a little deeper about this subject matter? Well, think, What would make someone serve on a slave ship? Was it to gain passage to the New World? Was it to feed their family? Was it just because they thought it was fine and I just need some money? We don't give the answer, but we want people to wrestle with those ideas. Working with the descendant community. So the descendant community, I've heard many people talk about working with the descendant community. When I go to some of these historic homes, different sites around the country, sometimes descendant community comes across as the people of African descent. We are the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and when we talk about working with the descendant community, we have to talk about all the descendants of the enslaved and the descendants of the slaveholding class, right? The descendants of free people of color, the descendants of poor whites, the descendants of yeoman white farmers. It's everybody. In order to have a full story. This is Joseph Trammell's handmade tin and freedom paper. We were fortunate enough to have Elaine Thompson, who is a resident of Loudoun County, Virginia, reach out to us in the way that Michelle mentioned, where people can call in, they can go online and see if you want to give a donation. She reached out to us and said, I think I might have something you want. Now, she's a very proud local historian. She's published a couple of books about the African American experience in Virginia, but this is her personal ancestors document. Her ancestor was Joseph Trammell, and this paper is from 1852. And so he created this tin to protect his freedom, because we know that any given moment it could have been challenged, and that was precious, right? So we interpret that to talk about the limits of freedom. But the other thing that's important about that is she did an interview with CBS this morning, and even she acknowledges the fact that what's powerful is this document tells us a lot about everybody in it. The man who signed for him as a witness, right? The county where he was free, and it even gives his description. He had a scar, he was only so tall. For her, that was very powerful because I never met this person, but then when I read this document, I actually met him. Okay? What's also powerful about that is intergenerational dialogues. She has a niece who is now 16. At 9 years old, this young lady actually wrote and published a book about her ancestor. And she's continuing to do more research on her family member and updating this book. She's actually offered to do some of our social media work to help delve a little deeper into this history from the voice of a young person to engage young people at their level, right? So this is important about the intergenerational dialogue, the descendant community, but also a genealogical journey. We are fortunate to have a genealogist on staff and an oral historian on staff. And those folks who we value dearly help us peel back the layers of the onion to understand a little more deeply, not just about this gentleman himself, but about the community where he lived and the people that he encountered through his African American lens, right? Community stories. So we went down to do some research in South Carolina, and we visited a couple of historic sites. And while we were there, I told a young lady, well, we're looking for a slave cabin. And my director had us all over looking for a slave cabin. It had to be just the right size. It had to be the right time period. And I had just come back from Louisiana. I'd gone down to Louisiana to look for a slave cabin there. And no sooner did I get back, I was sent right back out to South Carolina, Edisto Island, South Carolina, because the young lady had passed on this quest, and they reached out to us and said, I understand you're looking for a slave cabin. We have one we think you might want. Now, let me explain to you about this. This is a shared history, as I said at the beginning of this presentation. It takes everybody to tell this story. The Edisto Island Historic Preservation Society had talked to the descendants of the slaveholders of the Point of Pines plantation. They gave the Preservation Society this slave cabin, but the Preservation Society did not have enough funds to preserve it. And they didn't want it to get lost to the elements, and they thought it was such an important story that all of the world needs to see this. And so they called us up and said, we want to give it to you. The Preservation Society, the entire board is white, okay? When we went down and we looked at this cabin, and we did our preliminary research, and we found out all this fascinating history connected to this cabin. And then we were fortunate enough to have a young lady who's a genealogist who specializes in low country genealogy, Toni Carrier. She offered her services for free to help do more digging on the information about the slaveholding family and the enslaved community. When we took this cabin apart, we actually did acquire it. And when we took it apart, the community came out to see over the course of the week, having it dismantled. And it was a very organic conversation as people shared their stories about their families, about what they know about that community. What's important is, again, it was an intergenerational dialogue. So let me point this out. This is Toni Carrier, okay? These three are cousins. This is Arlene, this is Mr. Meggett, and this is their cousin Teresa. Mr. Meggett, this cabin was built in the 1850s. It was occupied until the 1980s. It was along what we call a slave street where you had many cabins. He actually lived in one of those many cabins in the 1930s. So we were fortunate to get him on tape, to get Teresa on tape, but we also connected with, in the community, the local church, and we did listening sessions with the help of a Reverend Chick Morrison. Arlene helped facilitate those dialogues between the community elders. I think it was mentioned earlier how sometimes you get a little kickback from folks who don't want to talk. She was able to facilitate those dialogues that helped inform us about this experience and help us humanize this story, right? Sadly, as of July, Arlene passed away. The youngest out of all of these in this photo, right? And so we know that that night that all of our donors came together, she was there with us in spirit. It's a very powerful story, and she's a very important part of this story. So collecting and connecting with the descendant communities help us work through some of the more challenging stories, some of the challenges of getting out the stories, but it's something that's memorable for sure. Again, this is a shared history, so what I want to share with you is that everyone in this picture, those are some of the members of the Edisto Island Historic Preservation Society, the descendant community, as well as the team that helped dismantle the cabin. And so it was a cross-section intergenerationally, gender-wise, interracial, class-wise. All these things are important because when we say this is an American story, it's a human story, people need to be able to see themselves throughout this museum. And what I can say is, it almost brought me to tears to hear where we've given out all our tickets till March. But what you should understand, if nothing else, is when we go in, and I think my colleagues will agree with me, when you stand in line, or you see that line outside the building, there are Black people, white people, Asian Pacific Islander, Latino, Mexican, young, old, girls, boys, men, women. And when they go into the museum, it's like this respectful hush almost. And then when you see them reading the labels together, and then when you hear the organic conversations take place in the cafe or just on a bench, it's very, very powerful. And I'm very proud that we've been able to achieve that type of environment. So here's one of the last few things I want to share with you. I really appreciate being able to take the tours that we have during the past few days. And I would be remiss if I tried to sit here and act like it's easy to tell these stories. But the fact remains that all of us come from areas that were touched by slavery and empowered by the fight for freedom, right? This object here is Nat Turner's Bible. Now, we were very fortunate to have the great stewards in the African American community come forward with their family treasures. Collectors come forward with their treasures. But Nat Turner's Bible came to us by way of a white family who had two ancestors, well, several that were killed during the rebellion, but one that was saved by an enslaved person who hid away that family member during the rebellion. There have been news reports on CBS News. They interviewed the descendant who actually donated this object, and they interviewed a member of the African American community, I believe in Surrey, Virginia. They are good friends, and they have different perspectives on that term. One believes it was horrible, senseless murders, but it's important for us to confront this history now and reconcile our differences. And the other saw him as a freedom fighter. But the point is, they're in conversation. And the point is that people say, we need to talk about this. And so I say to anyone who may think this history is not out there, it's gone, how do we interpret these things? It's just Johnny's hoe, it's more than a hoe. Johnny had a faith system, he had a family, he had a community, right? He had aspirations. There's ways you interpret this history, and there's ways to be inclusive across the board. And so this, I think, is a great example that helps us unpack some of this history in powerful ways to prompt dialogues on race, dialogues on what it is to be American, dialogues on the fight for freedom, dialogues on what did slavery mean. Now, the last thing I'd like to share with you is that there's no way in the world we could do the National Museum of African American History and Culture without looking at diasporic connections. So, our director charged us with making sure that we immerse our museum with diasporic stories, right? So we have the pleasure of featuring Peter Benson's Teapot, a gentleman, master silversmith, who was based between St. Croix and Philadelphia. And we tell his story, again, under the section of limits of freedom. While people were free, what were the limits on their lives during that time period? We also talk about the connections between planter elite in South Carolina and what they were doing in terms of their plantation enterprise in Barbados. The same with Louisiana, and cultural connections between Haiti and Cuba. And I didn't include on here, but we also talk about Rhode Island and the connections in terms of the illegal slave trade and going down to Cuba as well. And then we also look at colonization, folks thinking about freedom. Where do we manifest this freedom? Do we go to Haiti? Do we go back to West Africa, right? And also, we have our Thomas Porter buttons, which are based on the story of Thomas Porter, who was based out of Guyana. So those are just a few of the things, examples of how we try to make this an inclusive story in terms of the diaspora as well. I hope that this presentation has allowed you to consider different ways of interpreting objects and ways of looking for objects to really help tell the story. And of course, sometimes objects come to you that actually give you the story that you didn't even imagine at first. So it's been a pleasure to present to you today, and it's been a pleasure to present with my colleagues. And I'd just like to say thank you, even though it came up before.